Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Tauranga City Council. I've just got a minor technical problem with my laptop. If we can just defer for a minute, hopefully no more, we'll be back with you. Right, sorry. I will, however, while this is happening, open the meeting formally and call for any apologies. I have one from Councillor Bill Granger. Are there any other apologies? And can I call for a mover and a seconder for those apologies, please, for Gordon? Yako, thank you, and Steve, thank you very much. Public forum, there is none booked. Acceptance of late items, are there any late items? Being none, confidential business to be transferred into the open, there are none as far as I'm aware. Is there any change to the order of business?
Just the 2 items.
So we have 2 items. Firstly, can I just check, are there any conflicts of interest in respect of these 2 items with anyone? None given, thank you very much. So the first item of business is the approval of the Tauranga City Council submission, Taumata Arawai, the Water Services Regulator Bill. I take that as read. Are there any questions on that at all, councillors? Can I call for a mover and a seconder, please?
I might have had a question.
I beg your pardon?
Mark? I assume it would be, I guess, to Christine to start with, you can direct, but is this a good news, partly story whereby government has listened to our reactions to their ideas about taking over water and doing all this stuff, or are we still in that messy space?
No, I think this is sort of a stage 1. All those other matters in terms of the potential structure of waters in New Zealand is still a matter that's still on the table and to be addressed at a later point in time. So this is just putting in effect a regulatory body predominantly focused on setting of standards and trying to get improved quality across the country. The other matters on what it might be an appropriate structure and arrangements going forward still to be concluded on.
But putting in regulatory standards was a part of what Local Government New Zealand did ask them to do, didn't it? Wasn't it?
Yes, and Tauranga City Council is supportive of this. Much of what is proposed is good practice that we adopt anyway. So for TCC, they're actually, as I understand it, not no longer responsible for waters, but we've got minor tweaks and improvements, but not step change for our council in terms of how we address waters.
How far can they go if they're established, in the sense that there's some discussion in Wellington, of course, with the shambles they have with their infrastructure down there, and they still haven't addressed the issue that we addressed and gone to volumetric charging. Will they have the ability to go that far, Taumata Arawai? How far does the regulatory, creep, or how far can they go?
I'm not across the detail of it, but from what I have seen, that issue hasn't come up. So this is more around standards, training, qualifications of staff who are involved, those types of things, not around effectively pricing and those types of mechanisms. So they would come in a later, if they were to arise, I think that arise in the later stages of this review. Yeah, this is relatively ring-fenced, and it hasn't been controversial. There's been suggestions of improvements and things, but on the whole, my understanding is the sector is comfortable with the content of it.
Okay. It would be helpful for Wellington if someone else took the decision for them.
Councillor Robson, any other questions from the councillors? So the recommendation is that we approve the draft submission to the Taumata Arawai, the Water Services Regulator Bill. Can I call for a mover and a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Baldock. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Salisbury, thank you very much. All those in favour? Anyone against? Any abstentions? Carried. Thank you, councillors. Give me 2 seconds. The second item on the agenda is the adoption of the amendments to the Street Use and Public Places Bylaw 2018. Councillor Robson. Sorry, beg your pardon. Councillor Morris.
People commonly get us confused. I'm starting to get a bit of a complex.
Yeah, sorry, can I
That's
just
all right.
check before
Yeah.
we take your submission? Are staff presenting at all in respect of this today? No?
Our view is that we've presented on the material previously. There's nothing new. Happy to answer any questions, but we weren't intending to represent any information.
Thank you.
A question through you, Mr. Mayor, to General Manager of Strategy. The the Policy Committee was the hearings body, notwithstanding that some of the members of the Policy Committee look awfully familiar around this table, but the Policy Committee was the entity which heard submissions on the bylaw and formed a view. Is Council then able to amend the bylaw, not as the hearings entity, but is it possible for Council to do that?
Some help from Coral here, but I would think the answer is yes. It has the power to. It is the only entity in terms of the council or its committees that can adopt a bylaw, and it can consider the recommendations. The reality is the same people who have heard and considered the information. So my view would be yes. Coral's nodding the same thing. So yeah.
Just foreshadowing, I'm happy to move the recommendations of the Policy Committee at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Councillor Morris. Are there any other questions? Any other councillors? We have recommendations A through E. Is it your wish that we take them in parts, or would you like them as a complete package? Councillor Morris, would you like to move?
Yes, I'm happy to move all and obviously submit to yourself and members if you wish to take it in parts. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Morris. Indeed.
Thank you.
Can I get a second, Councillor Arbery? Councillor Morris.
Thank you. Just in speaking to it, following the election in October last year, Council decided to revisit the issue of the begging and rough sleeping provisions of the Street Use and Public Places bylaw. Having considered that matter, Council, through its Policy Committee, decided that the bylaw or those provisions of the bylaw were not the most appropriate way of addressing the problem of begging and rough sleeping. And so we consulted with our community. Hearings were well chaired in January, February. And then last week, the Policy Committee, by majority decision, confirmed Council's initial position that the bylaw was not the most appropriate way of addressing the problem. So I present the recommendations of the committee to colleagues for their approval or otherwise.
Thank you, Councillor Morris. Councillor Arbery.
Personally, I'm looking forward to seeing some positive solutions to these issues that our community is facing and working together with the group that is working on the homelessness strategy and also the other group working on the mayoral task force.
Thank you, Councillor Arbery. Councillor Robson.
Question, clarification, if I can, in the spirit of Bruce Robertson's approach to chairing. E1 and 2, so it's a question through the chair to the mover perhaps. The idea of looking at how we might support the retailers, stroke residents, stroke shoppers, stroke users of Great in some positive way, for instance, by putting an ambassador on the street, is that covered by E1 and 2, or do we need an amendment to make that option specific in terms of providing guidance to staff, do you think?
I'd direct that question to staff as the author of the recommendation.
Okay, so can I redirect that question to staff?
Can you just clarify what you're meaning by an ambassador? I suppose I'm just trying to understand the difference between an ambassador and enforcement, which is provided for in E2.
Yeah, so there has been some discussion, as I understand it, with the community and within the community about the fact that, if you like, E1 is addressing the negative in terms of the causes, and E2 is about enforcing bylaws. But there is a third option, and that is for council to place resource on the street that provides some degree of comfort to those people using the street that the street is, reassurance that the street is monitored and safe, and so a phrase often used when these processes or this approach is adopted is, provision of an ambassador, someone who somewhere less than a community constable, but someone who's the eyes and ears of council. They're not enforcing something, they're more in their presence providing reassurance to users and retailers that people care, and a small message to those who might be less than social in their behaviour that they are being watched every day. So it's that sort of positive side to it.
So in my view, that wouldn't be addressed by one, because that's
Thank
about
you.
resourcing and supporting other agencies. So what you're talking about, direct funding, and option 2 is only in respect of enforcement. So I would suggest that you'd have a E3, which is options to resource an ambassadorial presence to deal with behaviour in respect of bigging and rough sleeping. If you wanted to do that, I think that's a separate from what's here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Obviously, the discretion is the chair's, but I would have no problem supporting a resolution to that end to avoid us having to have a vote on amendments.
I beg your pardon. I will say this, if I may, before we and the adjournment's fine. And this is for the gallery and for the press. TCC have 2 bylaws officers. 2. Hamilton has 20 and Wellington has 12. It is, I would think, unquestionable to suggest that if we add this, it will make a material difference to how we are able to, and I use the word police in this sense, in the broadest possible definition of the word, police the streets in support of both retail shop owners and their shoppers, their customers. It has been something of a revelation, and I will say that we have gone through a lot of soul searching on this, and all the advice we've been given, and I have sought professional advice from a number of lawyers at a very high level, and it is absolutely firm in my mind that we will not win a court case, nor should we have to go through that. And it will cost us the thick end of $200,000. We will lose it, I'm sure of that, and I think that what we're trying to do here today is to apply resources of a practical and positive nature into making something more positive than this. So I think we should have an adjournment, if that's your wish, and to draft the yes indeed.
Make a comment. Given the timing of the annual plan and the fact that the annual plan report will be released either tomorrow, working on tomorrow, it would be useful if you were expecting this to be included in that conversation for next week in terms of resourcing, that you specify that in this resolution, because then you're giving direction to staff to include that as an option, which then would be debated. Otherwise, it would not come through that process, because it's really implying that you're going to do quite a lot more option analysis. What the staff could do is to basically give you some financial resource options, which you could then choose on Wednesday next week as to whether you want to include or not. So it's your call, but if that's the type of pace that you want to go, that would need to go on there.
Thank you very much. Very practical. Councillor Morris.
Question. Obviously, one for process. However, given the time pressure that the officers are under in terms of getting us some good information for March the 4th, would it be easier for this to be dealt with via a late submission to the annual plan from TCC itself, or given the potential numbers involved and given that we'd have to go through legal process anyway, it sits within the CE's delegation to deal with, and he can receive formal direction? What's your view on that?
It would be outside of the Chief Executive's delegation, I think. So we wouldn't be able to do any comprehensive options work. What we'd be able to say to you is give you an option of providing a quantum of funding resource within the annual plan that could then be allocated once you've done the work about how you want to spend that. So then you put a holding sum in, which would give you the financial capacity to do something. Then you'd go away and see how exactly would we structure this. the staff would come back, and then you would effectively release those funds when you're satisfied that they're with an option that you've selected for the use of those funds. But if you don't put the funds in there, there's nothing in there, you're not consulting with the public on anything, and it's not included in the overall rates calculation, yeah?
Right, thank you, Christine. 10 minutes? Is that enough to draft? All right, we'll call for a 10-minute recess. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your consideration of this. We have added, as you know, now Serial F, which I will read to you, and just to make sure we're all happy with this. Serial F now reads, includes funding consideration for Resolution E through the 2021 Annual Plan Prioritisation process. And I beg your pardon, and then 3, and the options to resource a council-funded street ambassador function. Is there any discussion on those amendments? Councillor Baldock.
Well, I'm assuming that's now the full motion as moved by the mover and sector. To speak on the motion.
Thank you. So Councillor Morris, you're still happy to move the motion? And
yes, and
Councillor Arbour, you are still happy to second the motion?
Yes.
You already have. Councillor Arbour, would you like to re-speak? Councillor Baldock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had a beautiful slogan that we would build a better city or build a great city one decision at a time. I'm not convinced that this is the right decision. Our responsibilities as councillors is to make bylaws, and I want to refer to Section 145 of the Local Government Act, which says a territorial authority may make bylaws for its district for one or more of the following purposes: protecting the public from nuisance, protecting and promoting and maintaining public health and safety, and minimising the potential for offensive behaviour in public place. The bylaw we had in place, I believe, was doing that, and I was prepared to support the amendments to it so that we didn't have to go to court and waste money there. Now it seems there's a proposal that we will waste money on more ambassadors and bylaw officers, which in the past have not made any difference to this problem. We had an ambassador. We had Paul, who worked tirelessly, was a wonderful staff member of council, but he was unable to do anything in Greaton to affect the problem. What changed things in Greaton and in other parts of the city was the enacting of a bylaw. And we've heard that consistently through the submissions that we heard as we discussed whether we would revoke it. Where we've got tangled up is that Section 151.1 about the most appropriate way of addressing the problem. And for that reason, I think some members are feeling we have to revoke. But in our street use and public places bylaw, we do all sorts of things. We have a bylaw, I don't know if everyone's aware of it, but I've brought it up before. We have a bylaw which says you're not allowed to sing in a public place. You can't preach, sing, make or perform music, lecture or busk in a public place. You can't damage, interfere with, destroy or remove any natural feature, so on. We have bylaws about graffiti. We understand that that's not all we do. We've had a task force in the past, a strategy for dealing with graffiti, because passing a bylaw is not going to eradicate the problem, and we knew that all the time. With this, we do need to do all these other things with the agencies in our community that are seeking to address the real problems that people have, or in many cases it's criminal behaviour which needs to be addressed, and our bylaw was sending the right message in that regard. So I won't be supporting the revocation of it. I would have supported, as we indicated in the policy meeting, an amendment to it. And certainly when it comes to the annual plan, I'm not going to be following suit with Hamilton and employing 20 extra, or another 18, we have another 18 bylaw officers, when they have no bylaw to enforce. By revoking this bylaw, they've got nothing to go out into the community and address this behaviour with. Ambassadors, trying to be nice to people and ask them to do things, is not going to work. How would that work in our general central government law if we got rid of laws and said, we'll just put a whole lot of, forget the police and the powers to deal with laws, we'll just ask people to be nice to one another and not hurt each other. We need law. It's not the only answer. It's never been a silver bullet, but this bylaw, I believe, had a remarkable effect upon the village of Greaton. And I am disappointed today that we would revoke it. I believe in time we'll be back here looking at it as we're now seeing it spreading into. I know it's a private area, but in Bethlehem Shops we've got problems. And as I said in my speech in the policy committee, when I went to Brisbane, I was shocked actually, but quite pleased to hear that they just simply have a rule that says you can't beg anywhere in the city, and the police enforce it. So I don't think we're making the right decision today, but I know people are well intentioned and want to address the real issues. I just believe law has a part to play in all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Baldock. Councillor Clout.
Thank you. I just really asked myself, has the bylaw as it currently stands worked? And I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes. We've had many shopkeepers, retailers come in here and telling us that it has worked. And so to me, that is the key issue. Now, people talk about the rights of the beggars, to free expression, freedom of association, yet Councillor Baldock has just read out some of the provisions of our current bylaw where you could argue that freedom of expression is also being stymied and squashed. Also, it's important to note that 76% of those who submitted were in favour of keeping the bylaw. And so I really want to see this continue. I'll be voting against the recommendations. I share Councillor Baldock's concerns about the extra costs of the so-called ambassadors. They won't have any teeth to them because there will be no appropriate bylaw for them to enforce. So I don't really see this as a good way forward at all. I'll be very disappointed if this recommendation goes through. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clout. Any other comments? Councillor Robson.
Yeah, I think the fact that we have a bylaw that prohibits lecturing people in the public place is clearly ineffective, as evidenced by some of the comments made in this chamber on a regular basis. Sorry, that was too big a target to go. I think we do need to place the decisions we're making in a broader context. And that is, and I've repeated this position, there is, I believe, in the resolution an acknowledgement that there is amongst certain people in our community something called fear. They feel, rightly or wrongly, on the basis of solid evidence or prejudice or whatever, a degree of fear, and we need to do something to address that. And I think the amendment effectively adopted by the mover and the seconder sort of in a way implicitly recognises that and says we'd seek to act on it. I think there's also, from talking to people in the community, and I thank Sally Benning for her time, evidence that the police here, in terms of resourcing community constable and that benefit that provides, have failed this community. I think we need to be honest about these. One of the things we're not going to do as a city is progress if we don't have an honest conversation about the current situation. Our local police cannot insist that they have adequate resource for fear of upsetting their political masters, and at the same time fail to provide the level of community policing that our community requires. They can't have it both ways. And I believe that if the local police would stand up to local government the way they stand up to gang members and others, this council would happily stand alongside them, saying to central government, you need to resource these things. In the same way we would stand alongside the DHB, who are not resourced to provide the facilities and social amenities required to help the disadvantaged in our community. We talk of collaboration, but the trouble is we don't start in a place of honesty. We accept certain constraints imposed by political ideologies driven by central government wishes to appease people instead of having an honest conversation about the requirements of our community. I recognise there is a problem in our community. I believe the causes are fundamental and most of them are outside our gift. What we can do is make a statement in our actions that is legal, respects the Bill of Rights, and is positive in terms of the outcomes it seeks to achieve. But that and that alone, I think, doesn't do what we're elected to do. I think we need to make it very clear that this community, not for the first time, is being let down by the failure of central government to resource key functions, right? There's some interesting research just being produced that shows that if you want to understand the housing issue in New Zealand, quite simply, you just need to look at how much money the state used to put into housing and the fact that it stopped in the mid-80s, right? The answers are not as complex as some would have you believe. It is a matter of choosing where we put our resources. What we're saying here is we need to put our resources not in the pockets of lawyers, but in staff to support the community. What I'm saying is central government need to stand alongside us. It's about time.
Thank you, Councillor Robson. Councillor Hollis.
We talk about caring and we talk about the well-beings and stuff all the time. And we really do care for these people who are on the streets and all of those things. I personally don't care if they become aggressive and intimidatory and predatory on our retailers and our residents. That sort of behaviour really peeves me off. To show our retailers and the 70-odd% of people who came to us and had the opportunity to ask us to do something, to then turn around and just ignore that, I think goes against some of the principles of those of us sitting behind this table, and I'll definitely be voting against this amendment.
Councillor Hollis, thank you. Councillor Hughes.
I believe that in this, in the amendment that we've put in to support some resourcing going into a positive solution and support on the street, we are looking in a positive direction rather than a bylaw and a direction that's to some people is in a negative place. What I also want to say is that even though 70% of the people did put recommendations forward in this, the people who are most affected by this are not the kind of people that can put in submissions. So well, no, actually, homeless people. Thank you. Anyway, I'm in support of removing the bylaw. Thank you.
Councillor Hughes. Are there any other comments from councillors? Councillor Hughes, thank you. Well, look, I'm just going to wrap up if there is nothing more. In all good conscience, sitting here, I cannot, go to the ratepayers saying that we are going to fight for, potentially $200,000 against the Bill of Rights to lose. And I truly believe we will lose this case. The police have come here, they've met with us, and they have told us that they can't and won't police this bylaw unless it tips into illegal practices, which are aggression and all that comes with that. And then they will, because they can. If it's criminal, they will police it. But up to that point, they can't and they won't. We have sought to, with Mayor Gary Webber and the Western Bay Plenty District Council, establish the Mayoral Task Force on Homelessness. That is moving as quickly as it can do in the circumstances. We have the Safe City Action Plans that is currently going into Greaton, and I think it will go in elsewhere. And the word ambassador, while it may appear to be unfortunate on the one hand, I do come back to the fact that we have only 2 bylaws officers. I appreciate that in removing a bylaw, there is nothing to police in respect of that. However, I think they could make a huge impact on, the behaviours which are deemed to be unacceptable by shoppers and by retailers. And the commitment that I will make personally to the retailers is that we will work extremely hard to ensure that through the Mayoral Task Force and other mechanisms that we will, find ways to deal with this issue. So I will be, you know where I'm going with this. So, Councillor Morris, you have right of reply, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to colleagues for the comments. I would, by way of right of reply, pick up the issue that Councillor Robson has identified in terms of central government's responsibility and resourcing our hardworking police. In my personal view, this bylaw process has been a 2-year distraction from actually working towards some solutions. I think we've deluded ourselves with our own a view of our own omnipotence in terms of what we can and cannot control. But the simple fact is that a piece of paper that both, I believe Councillor Baldock and Councillor Clout voted against resourcing additional bylaws officers to police last year. So when we're talking about ambassadors and not necessarily agreeing with that approach, you will recall that you both voted down a proposal to fund additional bylaws officers specifically to address this bylaw. So we can go back through the record if you wish, Councillor
I
Baldock.
think the
So,
member should have to be able to demonstrate the accuracy of it.
That is
Let's
correct.
have one
You can do
person
that.
speaking at
Thank
one
you.
time, please.
So that is correct. I'll just repeat that. So Councillor Baldock voted for not having bylaws officers enforcing this bylaw. And that is on record. And if I'm incorrect, I'll be very happy to withdraw and apologise. But that is a matter of public record. And so that's interesting when we're talking about ambassadors. So on the one hand, we've got an empty piece of paper that members were happy and content to have, which had no teeth. But then we're talking about how somehow that empty piece of paper has made a difference. It hasn't. Again, I think we've really wasted 2 years when we should have been advocating with government to resource housing, to resource solutions, and instead we've just been having circular arguments, flip-flopping all over the place in this chamber, and I appreciate some members weren't here to witness that, for 2 years on a piece of paper, for goodness sake. You know, let's get strategic. Let's actually fund the resolution of issues rather than funding lawyers and try and make a difference for our city.
Thank you, Councillor Morris. Councillors, I put to you, in that case, those in favour of, and I'd like to see a hands raised, please, the adoption of amendments to the Street Use and Public Places bylaw, I beg your pardon, 2018. All those in favour? And I declare the meeting closed.